So my love for comic book characters and futuristic sci-fi started at a pretty young age, and on the rare occasion that the two worlds would meet, I would be pretty much hooked every single time. I mean, you got Spider-Man traveling to space. On paper, to my 7-year-old brain, that's the coolest thing I could ever imagine. I haven't watched this show since it aired in 1999, but if you would have asked me before this recent rewatch what I thought the most underrated Spider-Man show would be, I probably would say this one. But going on 25 years later, does it still hold up? Do I still feel that same way? Quick answer, no. But there were some big swings that I do appreciate. Let's talk about the good, the bad, and the weird. Let's talk about Spider-Man Unlimited. It's really no way around it. From the creation to the execution, this show is strange. Spider-Man Unlimited was actually one of the first Spider-Man properties that was affected by the pretty infamous Spider-Man Sony Marvel deal. If you're a Spider-Man fan, you know back in 1999, Marvel sold the TV and film rights of Spider-Man to Sony with a pretty smart clause, basically stating if they don't make a new Spider-Man project every 4 or 5 years, the rights will eventually fall back to Marvel, which is why we get something new Spider-Man so often. Spider-Man Unlimited was originally going to be a continuation of the 1990 Spider-Man animated series, but with that new deal stricken between Marvel and Sony, they could no longer go forth with that idea, even though they kinda trick you into thinking it is a continuation with the beginning of that first episode. I'm sure you noticed that the majority of the characters in this Spider-Man Unlimited series are all original characters that are not from Spider-Man lore. And that's because with that clause between Marvel and Sony, Marvel was no longer allowed to use any of the other mainstay characters. Since they were already so deep into production, they allowed them to continue to use Peter Parker. You get a little bit of Venom and Carnage and this weird reincarnation of Goblin.
You're not with Venom and Carnage. You can think I am stupid, Spider-Man. Just don't talk to me like I am stupid. Okay?
When the creators got the unfortunate news that they could no longer do their continuation, their first thought was Spider-Man 2099. But lo and behold, that same year on Fox Kids Network, there was already a futuristic comic book show, Batman Beyond. So they scrapped that idea and we ended up getting the weird mashup that we got today. So the show pops off with what we are made to believe is the Spider-Man from the series that was previously canceled, but it's clearly not the same iteration of the character. And if you didn't quite remember, this show's premise randomly revolves around J. Jonah Jameson's son having a bad space launch. His space launch is sabotaged by Venom and Carnage, and their sabotage basically leads them to a place with one of the most creative names you have ever seen in comic book media history, Counter-Earth. Everything is supposed to be mirror everything that's on regular planet Earth, but yet there's no Mary Jane on this Counter-Earth. There's no other Peter Parker on this Counter-Earth. I don't knock them too bad because the writers' hands were pretty tied behind their backs. But yeah, they obviously didn't think that through too much, or they just figured the people watching it wouldn't pay much attention to it. Of all the people, using J. Jonah Jameson's son as the glue to your new premise is a little strange to me. The show started off with Spider-Man wanting to save Jameson and clear his name. They tried to make this as much Spider-Man as possible. So, of course, when the launch went wrong, J. Jonah Jameson was spreading rumors that Spider-Man was the reason for the launch's sabotage, and he was under heavy scrutiny for that. I actually really liked that angle. The public and the media were on him pretty tough, and when the police were in hot pursuit of Spider-Man, a building fell over and collapsed on him, so the majority of the public thought Spider-Man was dead. And honestly, I would have much rather seen the premise of that show and what that could have been versus what we got. In his public absence, Spider-Man goes to steal a ship where he's met by Nick Fury before he was modeled after Samuel L. Jackson. Spider-Man steals the ship, somehow finds his way to Counter-Earth where he's there to save Jameson's son. Now, I don't know how time and space work, but By the time he gets to Counter-Earth, J. Jonah Jameson's son has already led a rebellion. He has led a whole rebellion and revolution of human refugees. Because it's the late 90s, and in the late 90s, we had a lot of human and animal hybrid people for some reason. So why would this be any different? There were some human hybrids called the Knights who basically were under their creator's rule and took over Counter-Earth. And one thing I'm kind of torn about in this premise is the way Spider-Man reacts to this information. Jameson lets him know that he's staying there and is going to help out the refugees. Spider-Man's initial answer and reaction is extremely passive. Now I'm torn on this because some iterations of Spider-Man not wanting to get involved with something this big and major does make a lot of sense. But if they're trying to make us believe that this is the same Spider-Man from the animated series before, it's hard to think that he would be so dismissive of trying to help the people of Counter-Earth. And for me personally, whether or not this is true or not true to the character of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, I'm just not a huge fan of passive heroes. I like a proactive hero. And Peter having to be convinced to help people just for some reason just doesn't sit right with me. But it couldn't have been all bad, right? There had to have been a reason why I loved this series so much as a 6 or 7-year-old kid. And I think the main reason was that heavy sci-fi element. Although their hands were tied with some of the more comic book stuff, they really did go all in on the sci-fi. I mean, we have a group of rebel refugees. We have an evil ruler trying to take over an entire planet. We have mixed species people. And of course, there's a bunch of futuristic designs to a lot of the characters that still holds up today. Outside of the completely ridiculous and non-functional web cape, I really love this Spider-Man suit. And as far as the animated series go, it's one of my favorite Spidey suits today. And they were a little bit ahead of their time as far as comic book media on screen goes. Nowadays, every single superhero, whether it's Marvel or DC, seems to have this nanotechnology type suit or helmet that just magically appears over their faces whenever they need it to. At that age, I wasn't even reading comic books yet, so that's actually the first time I had seen something like that, period, and it really blew my mind. Much like a lot of the redesigns for Batman Beyond, everything here was very punk rock, very late 90s, which is very strange because although it is very nostalgic to the 90s, it also has this really futuristic tone to it. So the real villain of this series is probably gonna have to be the Sony Marvel Spider-Man deal, with the creators' hands being tied behind their backs so drastically and having to make this pretty much last-second Hail Mary. The show just didn't quite connect the way a lot of its predecessors or shows of other heroes around that time did. It goes back to the one thing I say on this channel so much that at this point it's pretty much the theme. Although these shows are definitely made for kids, it's pretty obvious that the ones that stand the test of time are the ones that don't treat the audience with kid gloves. You can make your tone of your show kid-friendly while still approaching topics and storylines that are going to touch them and stay with them into adulthood. This series seemed to propose a lot of very big questions and big ideas that never really came full circle. And although I loved it as a kid, this recent rewatch has made me realize why it's kind of fell by the wayside compared to a lot of its competitors of the time. I'm interested to know what you guys thought about Spider-Man Unlimited in the comments. Do you think it's a little bit better than people give it credit for? Let me know down below. It's your boy Eddie Knight. This is Nerdy Before It Was Cool, and I'm out.